Hello, everyone. So my name is Betimbeya. You can tell it Bija, it's not a problem. Most of English speakers do it like that. So I'm going to talk about something that is very close to my heart because basically I'm introducing it to the platform, which is collaborative PCF development. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself right now. So as I mentioned, my name is Betimbeya. I'm from Albania, and I'm a software developer since 2003. Basically, I started doing the software developer role during high school, part-time, obviously. And then I've been working full-time since 2000. You might notice it's a long period, basically between 2003 and 2015, but I took it slow while doing the university and the master's degree because I was also sports and working part-time as a software developer, as I mentioned. I was awarded the Microsoft MVP title in April 2022. Basically, I'm the first Albanian Microsoft MVP in 30 years of the program. So it's a really big achievement for me, personal achievement. And obviously, I got awarded for doing community contributions. And basically, I've started doing contributions since October 2018. And I got to know basically fake XRM easy, or the original test-driven development for Dynamics. And I fell in love with that product, with Dynamics, and with open source in general. So I've been contributing ever since. I own a company, a small limited company in Albania, which is called Shko Online, means go online. I'm working as a solution architect and basically working as a contractor with an Irish consultancy right now. And these basically are my contacts, and I will share them again later, but these are the most important ones to get in touch with me. So what are we going to talk about today? First is an introduction of code components or Power Up component framework. Then I'm going to talk about the official tools that we get to work with code components. And then obviously I'm going to talk about some limitations that we face. And I'm going to compare basically the test harness that we get from Microsoft, which is what Microsoft is offering us to do our development, in a sense, our local development, versus Storybook.js, and I'm going to talk about Storybook in a moment, if you haven't heard about it. And then I'm going to demo things so that it's going to be, I'm expecting questions, and I'm going to try and answer quickly. So the code components, right? Basically, it's I see it as one of the points where a low-code developer and a pro-code developer can collaborate basically between each other to deliver the most valuable experience for our end users. So basically, each stakeholder of our team can deliver what they know best, and pro-code developers can focus on actually creating the PCF components, for example, for a Canvas app or model-driven app or for a Power site. And low-code developers can take those components and configure them for special use cases or for the business needs, basically. So how do we configure? There is a manifest that describes what the component can do and enables the maker, in a sense, in the maker portal to configure that component in the environment. The Pro Code developer has mainly TypeScript to write the code of the component. Obviously, they can use JavaScript, CSS, HTML to build the component, or being a front-end, in a sense, library, you can use all the NPM ecosystem and use existing components and tools to so you can use whatever framework basically you are used to, or if you like, you can also not use any framework at all, right? You can just write the code in plain JavaScript and HTML. So if you, let me just want to read more basically about the code components, if you haven't done so already, you can basically go to this link and there is all the official documentation there. But this was the introduction, in a sense. So what tools do we have, right? The most important, in a sense, tool is the Maker portal, where you get to configure these components in your Canvas app, custom page, or model-driven app, or Power Pages site, or all these places where you can configure a PCF component. There are some other places you don't get from the Maker portal, but thankfully the XRM toolbox helps you with that. For example, in a business process flow, you can also configure a PCF component. And there are XRM toolbox tools for that. But we are focusing on the official tools, not the community tools at the moment. So we get the command line interface, so the PAX CLI. With that, we can do lots of actions for our PCF components, and it's the way to set it up initially, basically. If you have questions and stuff like that, you can write it in the chat. I'll try to monitor it from time to time. Then basically, in relation to application lifecycle management, the official tools that we get for working with PCF components, apart from obviously the command line interface where we can actually generate the projects and add links between them. The important part, PCF project, which is an MS build configuration to set up all your build in relation to your component. The CDS project, which is basically alternative to an unpacked solution, but it's smarter in a sense because it can have dependencies like your PCF component and other dependencies that you can map with using the mapping. And then you can just do .NET build of that project, and it can build everything at the same time. And for basically testing, which is part of the ALM in a sense process, we only get the test harness that you can launch using the npm run start. But if you noticed, or if you have a little bit of experience with this, you have already understood that what I'm showing you is too little, right? So there are lots of limitations because what Microsoft is offering currently, it's not the best for a developer at least. So limitations, right? The first and most important for me is there is no first-party support for unit testing. First-party means that Microsoft doesn't offer a way for us to unit test our PCF components, right? We have to help you with that, and I will talk about that later with the community. So you can do tests basically for Canvas apps, for example, with Test Studio, but that support the code components. So you are only limited to first-party components, and even those are not 100% supported, meaning not all of them are supported. Then you the test harness, as I mentioned, but test harness also has a lot of limitations. It doesn't implement all the component framework APIs, and we have taken care of also. And the experience is single developer focused, basically, because you can only start the test harness on a machine. And that means if you want to do a collaborative, in a sense, development, the only way to gather feedback for your components is by creating reference apps in an online, I call it demo environment, because the purpose would be to have probably demo components or even half working components, but you can realize that it's a lot limited as an experience. And for a developer also, it's a lot limited because since you have all those limitations that I was talking about, the only way to do a proper development, in a sense, where you can actually experience a little bit how your component is behaving, is by using Fiddler autoresponder to update your component's code while you are testing and developing. The issue with this is that you basically have still a limited single developer experience, because each developer needs to have his own Fiddler, in a sense, to play back that code. And it is really hard with these reference apps to create edge cases, right? So there might be even more limitations, right? I don't know if you have experience with PCF development and you want to share any other limitations that you have noticed. I didn't put more here because I haven't I am not using that much the official way to develop the code, but I'm using this other way that I will show you in a moment. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a comparison between test harness and Storybook.js. But maybe you haven't even heard of Storybook.js, right? So Storybook.js, and apparently I have closed the window. Storybook is basically a workshop, they call it, to build your components in isolation. And it is an open source solution, and obviously it is free. Let me just zoom in because I like to share with a zoom usually. I won't get into details of how Storybook works and what it does. Basically, it's just that consider it like some sort of test harness on steroids. It's basically, it lets you configure all your components and more, right? So I'm going to show you in a moment. I'm going to share the link in the chat. I see a comment, npm start watch would give the way for unit testing like workspace. In the future, it might be, but not for now, at least. The comment from Naveen. So the comparison, right? Test harness. Basically, as I mentioned it briefly before, you need the PCF to run the test harness. So you can only do the npm run start by having the PCF installed, and it's going to be a local thing. You can only run one component at a time. And I'm going to show you with Storybook that you can actually run more components at the same time and see how they interact with each other. I mentioned this, that it doesn't implement all the component framework APIs, and I'm mentioning it again because I'm comparing to what we have as an alternative. It does support data sets and fields, but that support is basically limited, and the framework events don't match 100% an actual environment events, right? This means that when you get an update view, for example, triggered, the updated properties might not be the same, or you get the data update view, but it is not matching 100% what you get from the environment. For example, if you have that data set in a Canvas app or in a model-driven app, you would get two update views. One says the data set is loading, the other says the data set updated, and you get the updated properties, the data set name. So what about, as I mentioned, it's an open source solution with thousands of contributors, and it's really, really going strong at the moment. They just released version 8 a couple of days ago, and obviously I've updated my code to version 8. One of the benefits is that it can be published as a static website, meaning that can run in GitHub pages, in an Azure website, if you have ever used that. It's really, really cheap to do it, and you can also add some level of security on top so that not everybody is able to access it. Or you can just publish it as a website in your internal corporate network where only your organization's members can basically see your component and play with it and share feedback. As mentioned, it's like a workshop where you can show all your components with different states. You can easily mock edge cases, and the mock word in there, so it's the keyword. You can mock it because basically myself and my company, basically, we created an open source tool or called Online Component Framework Mock, which basically mocks the entire component framework API. And every object in there is a fake object. And if there is something that we haven't implemented 100%, it is still a fake object. You can just fake a response for your use case in that specific scenario and test your component in isolation, in a sense, but you can test it without paying for a license because it's local. You can do your development in an offline first manner, in a sense. So you get your packages and dependencies, and then you don't need to have a stable internet connection. When you do it with the official tools, you need to be connected to a per platform environment, depending on your host environment, Canvas app or model-driven app, but still you need to be connected and you need to be with a pretty decent connection because it's going to take a lot of refreshes, right? But with this way of doing it, you can basically be totally offline, or you can be with an intermittent connection, bad Wi-Fi or whatever, the beach or whatever, in a mountain, wherever you like, right? So the component framework, I have a QR code here for the GitHub of the package, and it will basically send you into this link. I'm going to share that in the chat. I'm going to show the web API support in the PCF test harness and storybooks. Modern controls, is it mature enough to use? The modern controls for Canvas apps, it is mature, and it is having a lot of investment by Microsoft, and I think they are going to keep doing investments. I've seen posts other MVPs like very recently, yesterday and a couple of days ago, where they are adding lots of templates, for example, for screens, and on top of that, even the modern controls. Yeah, it is mature and it is having lots of investment, right? So I've shown you the library. Basically, as I was mentioning, you can host your storybooks on the cloud or it is a static website. There is also this Chromatic service. Chromatic is the company that has created Storybook, and they do offer a free service for hosting your storybooks if you like, and it is also at enterprise level where you get to do access and stuff like that. Obviously, enterprise is if you ask for enterprise features, you have to pay something, but I've never used enterprise features, right? Free is more than enough for me there. And I will show you, like, these are actual PCF components and are working outside of Dynamics in a sense, or of Power Platform. And it is the same code executing against the mocked APIs, right? So it is, as I mentioned, demo time. And I'm going to start with the web API control from the Microsoft Platform samples repository. I don't know if I have the link ready here. I don't think so, but I can share it afterwards. Basically, what we have done is we have created an organization on GitHub where we are gathering all the components that have storybook stories, and we called it PCF. I'm going to share the link right now in the chat. There are not that many because the tool hasn't got much traction yet, and most of the people are not making their stories. So mainly we have the stories where we have started writing the stories, and their maintainers, for example, David Rivard from Canada, is doing some almost always the stories for his own components, because it's a really interesting way to do it. So I have the web API control, and I'm going to do npm run start, which is the official test harness, the official way to test your PCF components. Zoom on 50. Okay, so it is not that pretty because it's a sample component. It should be focused on functionality. So if I click create, oh no, I cannot create because it is not supported. So it's not supported by the test harness or the framework, basically by the test harness, right? So if I want to delete the same, I cannot do it. It says down here it's not supported. Calculate an average value. Says you are trying to retrieve multiple records, not supported. So anything related to web API basically is not supported in the test harness. But if we go to Storybook, and I will do npm Storybook, these are open source, and we are part of that of the repositories in the PCF Stories organization. So you can go and have a look if you like at the code and the changes that we have done. So this is the local build, but as I mentioned, you can also publish this and share it with holders, right? So, for example, from the stories, I get lots of controls here. I didn't write specific stories, so combinations of these controls, because these are simple. I have only the one default story. And this is, for example, the web API thing. I can even put it on the side, open only the component. And then if I click create in here, I get the right result, right? In the same way as this was included in a model-driven app. So same for 100. If I click calculate average, for example, it says it's 150. I can click refresh count to see why. In a sense, it's 150, so I got one of each. Let me create another 200. And it says here you just created a new record. These are the values. And I can click refresh count to see it, calculate the annual value. What we haven't implemented yet, like zero configuration in a sense, or out of the box feature, is the select objects. So if I click select record to delete, the select objects is configured to give back an hard-coded ID 1. And the web API call is failing because it says you don't have a record with this ID in your database, right? Now, this works with a local database. Local means it's in memory in JavaScript, right? And you can see it even gave a warning here. I could not find the row. If you go to sources, you can actually see that we are working with the web API control, and you can see the original code that you got from TypeScript. And you can also see the storybook story here that applies somewhere. And let me show you the code a little bit for this component. I have a blog post that I wrote like 2 months ago, where it explains how to set up this for your own component and what this template in a sense is. I've shared the blog post link in the chat. I'm going to go quickly over the code, check. Someone can do a time check and tell me how much time I have left. So you get to import your inputs and outputs, so your type definitions of your control. You have to, if you want, import some things from Storybook, and I will explain those later. Then you import the component definition, and then from the library that we have created, the component framework mock, you can import your component framework mock generator, which is the object that controls the framework and has the in-memory database. In-memory database, which is using JavaScript version of SQL. So basically, if you have ever touched the Microsoft Dynamics CRM database on premises, or if you have worked with the TDS endpoint, you pretty much should see the same structure going on and the same queries in a sense. Obviously, the same because these are what we think the framework does. So we don't have access to the internal Microsoft code, but we have mocked for most of these things the framework, right? The platform does. And you need, for Storybook, you need to export a default object, which is the description of your story. This is simple, but if you see the others, there are lots of capabilities here. You can describe your parameters, you can describe your story, and you can set the default parameters or arguments. You can configure if you want controls and other things in, let me just show it again. Wrong window. So you can control these, which are the controls. These are basically the framework updating things, or the framework reacting to the component updating things, right? So these are synchronized, and these are two different components, though it's the same values. I can also do with bound to different columns, so these are not connected, but I can see the values in the platform being updated. Back to the code. So usually I describe with an interface which inputs and outputs I have for my component. This has these by default in a sense, but it's not using them actually. Other components are doing it. I do get to create a container where my component will draw in the same way as it happens in a Power Platform environment, where the PCF will give you in the init, will give you the container where you to draw your component, or if it is a virtual component or React-based component, then you will have a container that will basically be used to render your React component, right? The one that you generate from the update view. This use effect here is basically if you are used to, or if you know React, you see it is returning something. So it is calling this function only when the component is unmounted. So if you close your story, then it's going to call the destroy of your component, and it's going to your component if it's doing the right things, meaning clearing up resources or not. So first thing that we do is this is going to be executed at every run. So we are going to check if the container is not defined, then we are at the init phase, the first run, and we are going to define a container. So create element, a div. We can put, of course, yeah, we'll take a 5-minute break for praying, and then I'll restart. Just ping me whenever you are ready.
Lithium.
Yes.
We can continue, and after this session, we can take a break for 5 minutes, just for praying. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, then I'll continue. How much time do I have left? Because I didn't start a stopwatch. Just to know if I need to cut something. Okay. You can write it in the chat if you like. So I was saying we have to create the container. We can give it a class name if you want to apply the CSS. For example, I've imported the CSS up here, and I'm giving it the class name of the control so that it can apply that CSS, and I'll be able to test the component in the same way as I would in a real environment. I get this mock generator object. The constructor of this accepts basically the component that I'm testing or rendering, an object that specifies each property of the component, what type it is. We are forced to do this because Microsoft opted for TypeScript types to do the type inference and to understand which string is what. And basically, when you run it in JavaScript, I don't have the type information, right? So I need to give it an object over which I can iterate. Future improvement is that we are going to work on a template generator in a sense. So you don't have to type this. It will be generated from a CLI tool, command line interface tool. And you read your manifest of your component and generate all these standard things and give you extension points. And we need to pass the container so that the mock generator can basically push that container init of the component when it calls the init. Because this is what controls the component's lifetime and the interaction with the framework. It has a database, and in-memory database and metadata. We called it metadata, but I don't know if it was the best name to give it, but that's it. You can initialize the metadata. You can see that the definition here is the normal metadata object you get from Dynamics. So it's not really complicated, and it is not asking you to do anything particular right now, right? So it's not asking you to know how the framework works or how the platform works. It's if you have ever written unit tests, for example, with fake XRM Easy or other unit testing frameworks, it is similar, right? You are just initializing your in-memory database. So you are telling it you have a table called accounts, and it has these properties. I'm going to scroll over these. There are some properties which I just pass every time, like the context mode, if the control is disabled or visible. And also we need to call this database with data. I've created an extension on the context called set canvas items, meaning it sets the initial state of your component. Then you ask your mock generator to execute the init, initialization of your component, which will call on your component will call your init method with the right parameters and with the whole component framework API. This other if is basically the update cycle. So every time that this renders and I have mock generator defined, which means at any certain point I execute this, what is going to happen is I'm going to update my state. So if I updated the arguments, set them here. And if I have values, which I will show in other components, those will be updated, and then I'm going to ask the framework to execute the update view on the component. And this is the story that I'm exporting. This is pretty simple because it doesn't have inputs and outputs. Basically, it just needs the framework and to interact basically with them, right? Something like this. By the way, this is not my local story. This is on the cloud, right? This was, for example, I got undefined because I don't have any words, and I need to create one. And then I click here, I get the values. I'm going to close this and show you the other thing, which is the creator kit components. Basically, they are also open source, have a repository called so Parquet code components. Teams share overlay that blocks my view. So these slightly more complicated in a sense if you go and check the code, but not because of our framework in a sense, but you can see since these components are virtual ones, instead of getting the component framework generator, I'm getting the component framework generator React class, and then I'm defining my inputs and outputs for my stories. And then in here in the render generator, as I mentioned, I have the React one type, not the simple one or the standard component. And then this is identical. So this is basically a template that we created so that you can write your stories easily and always with less intervention possible, right? So it's almost a zero configuration thing for you to test your component. So you get to pass your component, in this case is the calendar, and you specify the types of all your inputs, and this component has lots and lots of them. And you can also pass another component here if you have output only properties. You can define which properties are outputs so that the rest of the properties are input only, and whatever is new here is output only. This is similar as you've seen in the other component, so init canvas items, and it has an event here if you want to connect the outputs from the framework with your host environment, which is Storybook in this case. You can basically rewire the onOutputChange function with a calls fake, because every function and every property is a fake where possible. So you get to choose what happens with these get outputs, or you can also do it like this if you don't want to use the get outputs again, because the platform has already done it for you. And you are using the Storybook update args to update that controls section with the latest value that you are choosing, right? And this is similar, execute init. It has that part where I was saying you need to update the values. Today I basically opened an issue in my own repository so that people are aware, which is the next thing that I'm going to implement, which is instead of having all these set values like this, I'm going to implement a single set value similar to the init canvas items, so that the platform can actually check has actually changed, right? Because currently I'm setting the values, but I don't get the right updated properties in the update view. And the difference for a React component, virtual component, is that we are using React DOM here to render whatever we get from the execute update view in the container. The execute update view is going to call the controls update view and get a React component, and that is going to be returned here and then rendered in that container. And we do return the container because the storybook is HTML. The trick is that the HTML storybook offers like lots of different frameworks, but we went with the HTML one, which means plain JavaScript and HTML, so that the user is free to use whatever framework they have in their system, and it's still going to work. Or if you have different components, one with AngularJS, one with React.js, one with plain JavaScript, Vue.js, whatever you have, it doesn't matter because it's going to just render it in an HTML, and your framework, which is included in your component, basically as a dependency all in the bundle, and you get the 1 megabyte or more file, then it's going to work the same here as it's going to work in your Dataverse environment. The story definition here is slightly more complicated. As I mentioned, there are some argument types that I need to define. And I've done this with an extension with a function so that it does something advanced. That's why I don't want to go more into detail. It's just describing all my parameters, how they work. And then I'm exporting my story. So this is the calendar story. And I'm going to basically, I'm focused first in the component itself. So npm run start. As always, I'm going to show the difference between the two. So I'm going to always do npm run start. And what you get is the calendar component. You have to configure all your properties here. And to be honest, I'm not so sure I know how to configure all of this right now, right? So it might look like I'm trying to make it on purpose, but it is too many things and I have to configure that every time, right? So I can go to play, but this is unusable for me, everything. I cannot click anything. If I instead go to here and run my storybook, and I still have the other storybook running, so it says the port is not available, but I can run it in another port without any issue. So we do have a couple of stories here. We have another repository which is referencing our old version of the component, which has a lot more stories, almost all the creator kit components there, but we will transition to the new one and we will deprecate that one in a sense so that people can only use the code that is the latest. If you do have any question, feel free to write it in the chat or raise your hand. I can complete the session as soon as my time is over. So as you can see here, for example, you can also write some descriptions, which is like a README file, but it is a little bit more advanced because you can also put live components in here in your description and play with them. Or you can put links, for example, like this. And let's go to the calendar because that's what we were testing. So I can play with the calendar like this, choose another date, or I can play filters. For example, one thing that I like to play with is the language. If I go to the Italian language, you can see that the component hasn't been translated properly because the short names are showing contain even longer names, not only the short names, for a human mistake probably. And I can see that, and basically with this, I just found a bug, right? So I can this link, give it to a colleague of mine, and then they can basically, let me just, I copied it. Let me close these things, open private window so that we know it's a different thing. The date. Okay. There is a thing I have updated to Storybook version 8, and there is something wrong with the selected date. Apparently, I'll need to fix that. So let me copy the link without a selected date like this to today, but Italian language. And if I go here, which means I can put this into my issue tracker, like Jira, whatever you are using, Azure DevOps, open a bug and say, with this configuration, the component is not behaving the way it should. I can take screenshots of this or just put the link there, and developer, let's say, so a maker that doesn't know how to change the code finds this bug and gives you back the link, and the developer can basically open the bug there, and they can also, as I mentioned, they can go in the and see the run through the code so that they can figure out what is wrong with their component. Or you can test your components, for example, with different combinations. So this is the breadcrumb component, and it has some items put here. I can update these and refresh because I haven't wired this to update them in time. Now I can see it's home too because I updated the value. It's part of the URL. And I can share this if I find something wrong. For example, I'm gonna try. I haven't tried it. So demo guys, be with me. And I broke it. Doesn't like a semicolon. Let me just do this really long text. Refresh. And I don't think if that is good to see in a sense, maybe I need to put ellipsis so that shorten that text, or depending on my use case. If that is a bug, I can share this link with my developer, and then the developer can hunt down the bug. Or even if I am the developer and I don't have time right now, for example, I just copy this link and put it as a note there so that I know I can return back to where I was. Obviously, you cannot do the same if you are using the reference applications in Canvas app or Moodle app, right? So if even though you can do that as a way to show your component working, it has a limited number of states in a sense that you can share, right? This, with a link, you go to the specific configuration, and you can also share a link that the initial developer didn't know in a sense that they needed. So you can also put like a edge case. You didn't specify any items, and you can see how this breadcrumb component will show if you leave it without configuring any items. Maybe you don't want this. Maybe you want a warning item not configured. You want it empty, something like that. You can just test it. this basically, if you click these breadcrumb items, we have wired in this story an action which tells you you are trying to open this item, right? So you selected the item with ID 3 and the name folder, or this one, for example, with the name like this. And you can, if you do it multiple components, you can also wire what happens when you click one thing or the other. Obviously, it's not a perfect simulation. You don't get to use PowerFX, for example, to wire the events. Would be good, but PowerFX is not yet JavaScript in a service. So there is no way for us to integrate that here. If they open source a JavaScript or TypeScript version of PowerFX, we can see ways to integrate that here so that you get like a almost 100% match of a Canvas app, but offline or local to your machine, or let's say outside of the platform, because it would be bad to call it offline. You can be pretty much online, but you are outside of the platform, which means you are a lot faster because you don't have all the other features. Every connector is local to your database because you are mocking it. Every other thing is happening on your dev machine, right? Or on the user's machine. The other thing, and I'll try to make it short, is basically the same component that we built for Storybook, and that you could also publish as a static website and gather feedback. You can also use to write the unit tests in an easy way. For example, in this test, which is open source and it's part of the component framework repo, and I highly encourage you to go and see those tests, how easy it is to write them, basically, is, so what I'm doing here is I have another object here called Component Framework Orchestrator. We added this recently, which allows you to control multiple components at the same time. And with this, basically, I'm telling the framework, I have an orchestrator which takes two components. The first one has this shape. So it has these inputs and outputs, and it is a standard component. And the second one has these inputs and outputs, and it is a standard component. If it was a virtual component, I can write through here, but then I would get an error in here because it says you are trying to pass a different type component, and these are not compatible. So we have done some real magic in the types so that you get the best experience and you get lots of autocomplete when you write the code. And since you have two components, there will be two containers for each of those components, which can be the same component. You might have two different controls of the same component, or it can be different components. They can bind to the same value or to different values depending on your needs, right? So whatever you can do in Dynamics or in a Canvas app, let's say, you can do also with this library. And you can see, except for this definition of what are my parameters and what are my controls, and this initial state or the state initialization for each component, which will be improved also to do something, do it once and it applies it to everything. It is pretty simple and it doesn't have too much, let's say, platform specific code, but it's almost intuitive. We try to make it as much intuitive as possible. And then I have the test, right? So I'm executing the init of my two components. I'm executing the update view. I didn't make the update view one single update view because for React components, I need to get the return value. That's why I'm doing it as two different calls. These are, as I mentioned, there is a lot of type inference happening. So this mock orchestrator 0 understands that that control there is basically control 1. There is some mapping happening with the types. And then my test is to expect the rendered value for this to be always the same, right? And the other test is if I click a button, I would expect that value to be updated in the controls. And if I run this test, I can just run both tests. You can see that the one test suite was run and there were two tests and two snapshots were captured because of those tests and I got the value, right? So if I do change something here, date 2024, and I run the tests again, one of the tests will fail because my snapshot is different. And now the developer can go and check what happened, right? So I was expecting 2023, I got 2024. So was that, am I updating my component or do I have a regression? And these kind of things can be put as part of your continuous integration pipeline. So every time that you push changes to your components, you push it to Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, and then you run your unit tests and you can get this kind of controls even in a shared manner, right? So if you go to the, I don't think I have the link ready here, but it should be able to go easily. Just a second. And if you have any questions, just please ask. But if you see basically the component framework mock, we are doing the eat your own dog food, right? So we do have Azure pipelines here that are running, and you can see there is a test run called coverage report, and you can go there, and you can see I'm not signed in into this, even though it's my own repository, because I wanted to be able to show it to you. And you can see you can publish your code coverage in your pipeline and check what is wrong with your code or your component. Obviously, this is of the framework itself, but the eat your own dog food in this kind of cases is really important. So you can see, for example, this component here is tested 100%, which is not something you should be aiming for, right? Like 100% of test coverage usually is sign of something. You were doing your tests just to cover all your branches, but in that case, you will miss important things, which maybe cannot be tested directly, right? It will give you some false safety. So try to write your unit tests and try to write them some meaningful unit tests, right? So the purpose shouldn't be just to achieve 100% coverage. For me, was 100% coverage because I'm not testing that actual component. I'm testing the things that are underneath, right? So I'm testing the framework itself for coverage. But you can see that having this is another way of collaborating with my stakeholders in the project, right? So if we are multiple developers and we can see in one change or pull request, or depending on your Git flow, you can see the coverage drops, for example, you can always figure it out easily and ask your dev to add some more coverage of your tests, or if you see that there was a bug and you know there is another test. If you capture a new bug, you know that there is another test to write to cover for that specific scenario so that it doesn't happen again, right? And the beauty of unit tests continuous integration is that they got covered from regressions. So they will run every time, so the same mistake isn't repeated twice, hopefully. So pretty much this is it. I am not seeing questions in the chat. I don't know how we are with time. I left the survey there. I don't know if it is still valid or not, but
yeah, let's scan it.
And obviously, thanks to the sponsors and to Mohammed for organizing this. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this organization and to be able to present to Saudi Arabia. It's the first time, and it's one of the places I would like to come in person, basically, to present and to visit, right? And these are my contacts again. I've put the component framework mock and PCF stories here just as a reference.